any man I've ever met.
Who are you looking for?
William Shakespeare.
I see a landscape. Oceans.
One of Father's players.
Will you be brave?
Children's hearts beat. They smile, play.
Mama!
My boy.
What is in it?
In what?
The play.
To sleep, perchance to dream.
Why?
Bye.
Bye.
The first light of dawn barely reached the hidden library beneath the abandoned chapel as Hamnet stood motionless with the Chronicle of Echoes resting in his hands, its pages continuing to fill with shimmering golden words that seemed to write themselves faster with every heartbeat. Revealing forgotten moments from the lives of countless ordinary people whose quiet acts of kindness had changed the destinies of families, villages, and even kingdoms without ever being celebrated in history. While Elias carefully explained that every page represented a memory rescued from the silence before it could disappear forever, warning Hamnet that once a memory was erased completely it could never inspire another generation again. Making compassion itself weaker with each passing year, and before the young guardian could ask another question the candles surrounding the endless library suddenly flickered as an icy wind swept through the underground halls, extinguishing several flames at once while dark cracks slowly spread across the stone floor, releasing faint whispers that repeated forgotten names no living person could recognize, causing Elias to tighten his grip on an ancient staff carved from ash wood as he quietly admitted that the enemy had already sensed the Chronicle awakening. Because for centuries the silence had searched for the book, believing that destroying it would allow fear and selfishness to replace every story of courage ever remembered, and moments later shadow-like figures emerged from the darkness between towering bookshelves. Not walking but gliding silently across the floor with faces hidden beneath long black cloaks woven from drifting smoke, each carrying empty scrolls capable of absorbing memories from anyone they touched. Yet instead of attacking immediately they began pulling glowing words from nearby books, causing entire volumes to fade into blank pages as if the people recorded within them had never existed, prompting Hamnet to instinctively protect the Chronicle against his chest, where its cover suddenly released a circle of brilliant golden light that pushed the shadows backward for the first time in centuries, surprising even Elias, who realized the Chronicle had accepted Hamnet more completely than any guardian before him. While the library itself responded by awakening enormous stone statues lining the ancient halls, each representing forgotten keepers from generations past, their eyes glowing softly as hidden passages opened throughout the vast archive, revealing chambers containing relics created not for war but for preserving truth, memory, forgiveness, and hope. And Elias hurried Hamnet through the winding corridors toward the Hall of Living Stories. explaining that every guardian's greatest strength came not from defeating enemies through force but from reminding people who they truly were whenever darkness convinced them to forget, as behind them the advancing shadows continued consuming countless unwritten histories. Their whispering voices growing louder with every erased memory until the entire underground sanctuary trembled beneath their relentless advance, while above the peaceful village nothing seemed unusual as children laughed in the streets. Merchants opened their small shops, farmers worked their fields, and families greeted another ordinary morning completely unaware that beneath their feet a silent battle had already begun for the survival of every story that had ever taught humanity the meaning of love, sacrifice, loyalty, mercy, and hope, leaving Hamnet to understand that protecting the chronicle would require far more than bravery because he would soon have to prove that even the quietest act of goodness could outshine the deepest darkness the world had ever known. Release date: December 5, 2025. Budget: $30 United States dollars minus 35 million. Box office. This story is completely original and not based on the real film's plot. In a quiet English village surrounded by endless forests and rolling fields, a young boy named Hamnet lived with an imagination that made every sunrise feel like the beginning of a legend, believing that every person carried an invisible story waiting to be discovered, while his mother Agnes understood the language of herbs, rivers, birds, and changing seasons better than anyone in the village, teaching Hamnet that nature remembered everything even when people forgot, and his father William spent long periods away writing plays in London. Returning home with tales of kings, queens, warriors, and dreamers that filled the small cottage with hope, yet Hamnet cared less about famous heroes than ordinary people whose courage was never written into history. Spending his days wandering through ancient woodlands, climbing forgotten ruins, listening to old travelers, and asking questions that few adults could answer, until one cold autumn morning he discovered an abandoned stone chapel hidden deep inside the forest where strange carvings covered every wall, depicting countless generations protecting a mysterious book known only as the Chronicle of Echoes, a manuscript said to preserve the memories of anyone whose kindness changed another person's life, whether history remembered them or not. And although the pages appeared blank, an elderly traveler suddenly emerged from the shadows and quietly explained that the chronicle revealed its words only to those who valued compassion above ambition, warning Hamnet that darkness did not always arrive carrying swords because sometimes it appeared as fear, greed, pride, or silence, slowly convincing good people to forget one another, before disappearing without revealing his name, leaving Hamnet holding an ancient wooden key engraved with symbols unlike anything he had ever seen. And as the weeks passed, unusual events spread across the countryside, with villagers forgetting familiar songs, children unable to remember treasured stories told by their grandparents, old friendships fading without explanation, and entire family traditions disappearing as though they had never existed, causing unease throughout the community while no one understood what was happening. Except Hamnet, who noticed the mysterious key glowing whenever another forgotten memory vanished, convincing him that the strange disappearances were connected to the hidden chapel, so one moonlit evening he secretly returned alone, unlocking a concealed doorway beneath the cracked stone floor that led into an underground library illuminated by thousands of softly glowing candles, where shelves stretched farther than the eye could see, filled with books recording forgotten acts of courage, sacrifice, forgiveness, and love from countless generations, each volume representing lives that history had overlooked yet which quietly transformed the world through simple acts of goodness. And standing at the center of the endless library was an elderly guardian who introduced himself as Elias, the keeper of forgotten stories, explaining that whenever humanity stopped valuing compassion, the chronicle weakened, allowing shadows called the silence to erase memories that inspired future generations, until entire civilizations eventually lost their identity because they no longer remembered the people whose kindness had built them. revealing that Hamnet had been chosen not because he was the strongest child but because he never stopped asking why ordinary people mattered, and with those words Elias placed the glowing chronicle into Hamnet's hands. Where blank pages suddenly filled with golden writing describing moments from Hamnet's own life that even he had forgotten, proving the book had accepted him as its next guardian, while far beyond the village an unseen figure watched the library awaken after centuries of silence. Smiling as storm clouds gathered across the horizon because the rebirth of the chronicle also signaled the return of an ancient enemy who believed memories themselves were humanity's greatest weakness, setting into motion a journey that would challenge Hamnet's courage, compassion, and belief that even the smallest act of kindness could outlive kings, wars, and the passing of centuries. The Hall of Living Stories stretched farther than Hamnet could see, its towering walls covered with glowing shelves that held countless crystal spheres instead of books, each sphere containing the living memory of a single act of compassion that had quietly changed someone's life. While soft golden light drifted through the vast chamber like fireflies, illuminating ancient murals that showed generations of keepers protecting the Chronicle of Echoes from forces determined to erase hope from human hearts. And as Elias guided Hamnet deeper into the sanctuary, he explained that memories were more powerful than swords because every courageous decision inspired another, creating an endless chain that strengthened humanity across centuries. Whereas the silence sought to break those invisible connections until every generation believed kindness had never truly mattered, and before Hamnet could fully understand the weight of his new responsibility, a loud crack echoed through the underground halls as one of the crystal spheres suddenly shattered into thousands of fading sparks, causing everyone nearby to experience a terrible emptiness for a brief moment, as though an important story had vanished forever. While Elias immediately recognized the loss and sadly revealed that the memory belonged to an unknown woman who had once sacrificed her own safety to rescue strangers during a devastating winter storm generations earlier. But because her story had now been erased, no one in history would ever remember her courage again, making Hamnet realize that every forgotten memory was not merely disappearing from books but from the very soul of humanity itself, filling him with determination stronger than fear. And at that moment the chronicle resting in his hands opened by itself as new golden words appeared across its pages, instructing the young guardian to begin gathering the 4 living seals hidden across England before the silence reached them first. Explaining that each seal protected one essential virtue upon which the chronicle depended: hope, mercy, truth, and sacrifice. And if even one of those sacred relics fell into darkness, the chronicle would gradually lose its power to preserve the memories that inspired future generations. While Elias revealed an ancient map concealed beneath the chamber floor showing forgotten monasteries, abandoned castles, hidden forests, and long-lost villages connected by invisible paths known only to the keepers. Each location guarding one of the 4 living seals behind trials designed not to test strength but character, because only those willing to place others before themselves could awaken the relics. And as Hamnet studied the weathered map, a sudden tremor shook the sanctuary once again, stronger than before, sending dust falling from the ceiling while distant echoes of whispering voices filled every corridor, announcing that the silence had discovered another entrance into the underground library. Forcing Elias to act quickly as he handed Hamnet a small leather satchel containing simple supplies, an old compass that pointed not north but toward forgotten memories in danger, and a silver pendant engraved with the emblem of the first keeper. Explaining that the journey ahead would lead through lands where ordinary people unknowingly carried extraordinary stories waiting to be saved, while he himself would remain behind with the remaining guardians to delay the advancing darkness for as long as possible, giving Hamnet enough time to reach the first living seal before the enemy. And although the young guardian hesitated at the thought of leaving those who had welcomed him, Elias smiled with quiet confidence and reminded him that every great story began with uncertainty rather than certainty, urging him never to measure courage by the absence of fear but by the decision to keep walking despite it. and with those final words Hamnet climbed the narrow stone staircase leading back toward the quiet world above. Emerging beneath the pale morning sky where birds sang peacefully over fields of green as though nothing had changed, yet hidden beyond the distant hills dark storm clouds slowly gathered along the horizon, carrying with them the unseen advance of the silence while the chronicle of echoes pulsed gently against his heart, guiding the young guardian toward the first step of a journey that would decide whether the forgotten stories of humanity would survive for future generations or disappear forever into endless silence. The old compass resting inside Hamnet's satchel slowly began turning on its own as he crossed the quiet countryside beyond Stratford, ignoring every familiar direction until its silver needle settled firmly toward the distant eastern hills where thick forests concealed ruins abandoned long before anyone in the village could remember. While the Chronicle of Echoes remained warm against his chest, its golden pages occasionally revealing brief sentences that disappeared as quickly as they appeared, guiding him without ever revealing the complete path ahead. And throughout the journey Hamnet encountered ordinary people whose unnoticed kindness quietly strengthened his determination, including an elderly shepherd who shared his last loaf of bread with hungry travelers despite having little for himself. A young girl who patiently carried water every morning to an injured horse abandoned beside the road, and a widowed blacksmith who repaired broken farming tools without accepting payment from struggling families. Each simple act causing faint streams of golden light to rise unnoticed into the sky before flowing gently toward the chronicle, proving that every compassionate choice continued feeding the living memory of humanity even when no reward or recognition followed. While hidden among the trees the unseen servants of the silence watched these moments with growing frustration, unable to understand why goodness continued surviving despite centuries of fear. And as evening approached Hamnet finally reached the edge of Blackbriar Forest. An ancient woodland where enormous twisted oaks blocked much of the fading sunlight, creating endless shadows that seemed to shift with every passing breeze, yet the silver pendant given by Elias glowed softly whenever darkness gathered too closely, encouraging him to continue deeper into the silent forest until he discovered the weathered remains of St. Alwyn Abbey, its stone walls broken by time, ivy covering ancient windows, and vines wrapping themselves around towering bell towers that had not rung for generations. Although the place felt strangely peaceful rather than abandoned, as though invisible guardians still watched over every crumbling stone, and inside the ruined sanctuary Hamnet found faded paintings depicting four radiant figures holding symbols representing hope, mercy, truth, and sacrifice, confirming that he had reached the resting place of the first living seal. But before he could search further the silence surrounding the abbey suddenly disappeared as whispers echoed through every corridor. Cold mist spread across the cracked floor, and shadow-covered figures slowly emerged from broken archways carrying long black lanterns whose empty flames consumed colors instead of producing light, causing flowers to wilt and carved inscriptions to fade wherever they passed. While the chronicle abruptly opened by itself and projected a brilliant circle of golden light around Hamnet, revealing an inscription hidden beneath centuries of dust that declared only a heart willing to protect strangers before itself could awaken the first living seal. And before the words had fully faded, frightened voices cried out from beyond the abbey walls as several lost travelers stumbled into the ruins pursued by the advancing shadows, forcing Hamnet to make his very first choice as the keeper of the chronicle. Realizing that reaching the sacred relic meant nothing if innocent lives were abandoned in the process, so without hesitation he ran toward the terrified strangers rather than toward the hidden chamber where the first living seal waited. And the moment that selfless decision filled his heart, the entire abbey erupted with radiant golden light. Ancient bells rang across the forgotten valley for the first time in centuries, and beneath the central altar a magnificent crystal shaped like a rising sun slowly emerged from the stone itself, announcing that the trial of hope had already begun long before Hamnet ever realized he was being tested. The radiant crystal rose slowly from beneath the ancient altar, filling the ruined abbey with warm golden light that pushed every shadow toward the broken walls, while the frightened travelers gathered behind Hamnet in disbelief. Watching the mysterious brilliance spread through the cracked stone floor like flowing sunlight, and the servants of the silence recoiled as their dark lanterns flickered violently, unable to withstand the growing power of the first living seal. Yet they did not retreat, for a deep voice echoed through the ruined sanctuary, calm and cold, declaring that hope was always easiest to destroy just before victory seemed certain, and from the darkness emerged a tall figure cloaked in black robes stitched with silver symbols that resembled broken stars. His face hidden beneath a weathered mask of polished obsidian, introducing himself only as Morven, the first herald of the silence, explaining that he had spent centuries erasing the forgotten heroes of history until entire generations believed courage belonged only to legends. While ordinary kindness vanished without a trace, and with a single motion of his hand the ruined abbey transformed into an illusion where Hamnet saw visions of his home village consumed by despair, his parents forgetting his name, friends walking past one another without recognition, children laughing at acts of compassion as though kindness had become weakness, and every glowing page within the chronicle turning blank one after another until only empty parchment remained, causing doubt to creep quietly into Hamnet's heart for the first time since accepting the responsibility of keeper. But before fear could take hold he remembered the shepherd who had shared his final loaf, the young girl who cared for the injured horse, and the blacksmith who expected nothing in return for helping others, realizing those simple acts had never depended upon recognition or reward, because true goodness existed even when history failed to record it. And as that understanding settled within him the chronicle burst open with dazzling brilliance, its pages releasing thousands of golden feathers that circled through the abbey like living light, dissolving Morven's terrifying illusion piece by piece until the true sanctuary reappeared. While the crystal at the altar floated into the air and gently settled into Hamnet's hands, becoming the first living seal of hope, its surface glowing with an inner sunrise that filled every heart nearby with renewed courage. And the frightened travelers who moments earlier had been frozen by fear now stood together to protect one another, proving that hope spread from one soul to another faster than darkness could consume it. Forcing Morven to step backward as cracks slowly formed across his obsidian mask, though he laughed quietly instead of showing anger, warning Hamnet that the remaining 3 living seals would demand far greater sacrifices than simple bravery, because each trial would ask him to surrender something precious before granting its blessing. And with those final words Morven dissolved into drifting black mist carried away by the evening wind, leaving only silence behind as the ruined abbey gradually returned to peace. While the ancient murals upon its walls shimmered once before revealing a hidden passage beneath the altar where a narrow stone staircase descended into darkness, and the chronicle wrote a new message across its glowing pages, revealing that the path toward the second living seal had already opened far beyond the northern mountains where the forgotten monastery of Mercy stood waiting for the next guardian courageous enough to continue the journey. As Hamnet quietly placed the crystal of hope inside his satchel, thanked the rescued travelers for reminding him why ordinary lives mattered most, and stepped into the hidden passage with steady determination, unaware that unseen eyes continued watching every choice he made, patiently preparing the next trial where compassion alone would no longer be enough to overcome the growing power of the silence. Leaving the ruined abbey of St. Alwyn behind, Hamnet carried the first living seal of hope through mist-covered valleys where every sunrise seemed brighter than the one before, yet the chronicle of echoes remained strangely silent, as though preparing him for a trial that words alone could not explain. Days later, after crossing rocky hills and dense pine forests, he reached the towering gray mountains where the forgotten monastery of Mercy rested upon a narrow cliff overlooking an endless sea of clouds. The ancient monastery appeared deserted, its weathered stone walls scarred by centuries of wind and rain, but every doorway bore the same symbol carved into the rock, a pair of open hands surrounding a single flame. As Hamnet climbed the worn stone steps, the crystal of hope glowed warmly inside his satchel, revealing that the second living seal was hidden somewhere within the sacred sanctuary. Before he could enter, a frail old monk emerged from the shadows carrying nothing except a wooden staff polished smooth by countless years of use. Without asking Hamnet's name, the monk smiled gently and said that every traveler who sought mercy first had to understand the weight of another person's suffering. He led Hamnet into the monastery, where dozens of travelers, villagers, and wandering pilgrims rested in silence, many wounded, hungry, or exhausted after escaping famine, storms, and conflict. The old monk offered Hamnet a simple choice: continue searching immediately for the second living seal or spend the day caring for the strangers whose pain had gone unnoticed by the world. Remembering Elias's words that every keeper was measured by character rather than strength, Hamnet placed his satchel beside the monastery door and devoted himself to helping those in need. He carried water from a mountain spring, prepared meals from the monastery gardens, repaired broken roofs before an approaching storm, listened to lonely elders who believed everyone had forgotten them, comforted frightened children with stories of brave ordinary people, and worked beside the monks until long after darkness covered the mountains. Unknown to him, every selfless act caused faint silver light to gather beneath the monastery floor. At midnight the old monk quietly led Hamnet into an underground sanctuary where a circular chamber contained 12 stone pillars surrounding an empty pedestal. The walls suddenly came alive with glowing symbols as the chronicle opened on its own, revealing a single sentence written in radiant gold: "Mercy is remembered not by those who receive it, but by those who choose it when no reward is promised." The chamber trembled as hidden mechanisms awakened, and from beneath the pedestal slowly rose a magnificent silver crystal shaped like a pair of unfolding wings, the second living seal of mercy. The instant Hamnet reached toward it, icy darkness swept through the sanctuary as black mist poured from cracks between the stones. Morven's voice echoed once more through the chamber, mocking the young keeper by claiming that compassion always faded when fear became stronger than hope. Shadow figures emerged carrying chains forged from forgotten regrets, attempting to imprison every frightened pilgrim sleeping above the monastery. Refusing to retreat, Hamnet lifted the crystal of hope while extending his free hand toward the newly awakened seal of mercy. The two relics answered each other with brilliant golden and silver light, creating a shield that broke the shadow chains before they could reach the innocent. The monastery bells rang across the mountains, their sound carrying for miles through the night as the darkness recoiled once again. The old monk smiled with quiet pride, placed the second living seal into Hamnet's hands, and revealed that he had been the final guardian of mercy for more than 60 years, waiting for the next keeper worthy enough to continue the ancient mission. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold, the chronicle revealed the next destination, a forgotten fortress hidden beyond the northern marshes where the third living seal of truth had remained untouched for centuries. But far away, within a fortress of endless shadows, Morven knelt before an unseen ruler whose glowing crimson eyes opened for the first time in ages, signaling that the true master of the silence had finally begun to awaken. The morning after the monastery of mercy fell silent once more, Hamnet secured the first and second living seals inside the leather satchel Elias had given him and followed the chronicle's glowing instructions toward the northern marshes, where the third living seal of truth had remained hidden since the age of the first keepers. The journey led him through vast wetlands wrapped in silver mist, where narrow paths disappeared beneath dark water and ancient willow trees leaned over forgotten trails like silent guardians watching every traveler who dared to pass. Strange voices drifted across the marshes, sometimes sounding like lost friends calling his name, other times like frightened children pleading for help, yet the crystal of hope glowed whenever the voices were false, while the seal of mercy warmed gently whenever genuine suffering lay nearby, allowing Hamnet to distinguish compassion from deception. After several days he reached the ruins of Blackmere Fortress, an immense stone stronghold rising from the center of the marshes, its broken towers reflected in still water that resembled polished glass. The fortress gates stood open, but no guards remained. Instead, hundreds of weathered statues lined the entrance, each carved with astonishing detail, their expressions filled not with fear but with quiet determination, as though they had willingly accepted whatever fate had turned them into stone. Inside the great hall, Hamnet discovered a massive circular chamber where an ancient mirror stretched from floor to ceiling. Unlike ordinary glass, its surface shimmered like liquid silver, and as Hamnet stepped closer, the reflection before him slowly changed. Instead of showing the young keeper, it revealed countless versions of himself, one tempted by power, another consumed by pride, another abandoning strangers to save himself, and another destroying the chronicle to escape responsibility. Every reflection whispered that truth was painful, that people preferred comforting lies, and that no one could carry the burden of remembering the entire world. For a brief moment doubt entered Hamnet's heart, but he remembered the unknown heroes whose kindness filled the chronicle and realized that truth was not the absence of weakness. It was the courage to face weakness without surrendering to it. As soon as he accepted every part of himself, both strengths and fears alike, the mirror shattered into thousands of glowing fragments that floated through the chamber like stars. Behind the broken mirror appeared a hidden sanctuary where the third living seal rested upon a marble pedestal, shining with a deep sapphire light that illuminated every corner of the forgotten fortress. Yet before Hamnet could claim it, Morven emerged once again, no longer hiding behind illusion but carrying an ancient black blade forged from erased memories. He declared that the age of the keepers was ending because people no longer cared about truth, only comfort, and that the master of the silence would soon erase every memory powerful enough to unite humanity. Raising the blade of oblivion, Morven unleashed a storm of darkness that swept through Blackmere Fortress, causing walls to crack and the ancient statues to tremble. Hamnet stood his ground, lifting the seals of hope and mercy while reaching toward the glowing sapphire crystal. The instant his hand touched the third living seal, brilliant blue light erupted through the fortress, exposing every illusion created by the silence. The black blade fractured, Morven staggered backward as cracks spread across his obsidian mask, and for the first time his true face briefly became visible before darkness concealed it again. Furious yet unable to overcome the combined power of the three living seals, Morven disappeared into a whirlwind of black ash, warning that the final trial would demand more than courage, compassion, or honesty, it would demand sacrifice beyond imagination. As silence returned to Blackmere Fortress, the stone statues slowly transformed back into living guardians who had been imprisoned by deception for generations. Kneeling before Hamnet, they thanked the new keeper for restoring the truth they had protected with their own lives. The chronicle then opened once more, its golden pages revealing a single glowing path leading toward the distant Valley of Ashes, where the fourth and final living seal of sacrifice awaited, while above the horizon a blood-red eclipse slowly began covering the sun, announcing that the true ruler of the silence was preparing to leave the shadows at last. A crimson eclipse spread across the heavens as Hamnet departed from Blackmere Fortress, carrying the three living seals of hope, mercy, and truth, each glowing with its own gentle light inside the satchel that now felt far heavier than before, not because of their weight but because every step brought him closer to the final trial that generations of keepers had feared above all others. The Chronicle of Echoes no longer displayed maps or directions. Instead, its pages revealed memories of forgotten heroes who had willingly surrendered their comfort, dreams, and even their lives so that others might continue living in peace, teaching Hamnet that true sacrifice was never about seeking glory but about choosing another person's future over one's own. After many days of travel he reached the Valley of Ashes, a vast land where ancient forests had long ago been reduced to silver-gray trees that never shed their leaves, while rivers flowed silently beneath blankets of white mist and the air carried the faint sound of voices from ages long past. At the center of the valley stood the Temple of the Last Flame, its towering pillars cracked by centuries yet still standing proudly beneath the darkened sky. As Hamnet entered the temple, every torch along the walls ignited without flame, glowing instead with soft golden light that seemed alive. In the heart of the sanctuary rested an empty stone pedestal surrounded by 4 carved circles, clearly waiting for the living seals. Hamnet carefully placed the seals of hope, mercy, and truth into their rightful places, and at once beams of golden, silver, and sapphire light rose toward the ceiling, joining together into a single brilliant column that awakened the temple after centuries of silence. The ground trembled, ancient doors slowly opened, and from the deepest chamber emerged an elderly woman dressed in robes woven from shimmering white threads. She introduced herself as Seraphine, the first keeper's final apprentice and the last guardian of the 4th living seal. Looking into Hamnet's eyes, she spoke gently, explaining that no keeper had ever claimed the seal of sacrifice through strength or wisdom alone, because the final relic could only be awakened when someone willingly accepted personal loss without knowing whether that loss would ever be restored. Before Hamnet could respond, the temple was shaken by a thunderous roar as the roof darkened beneath swirling clouds of shadow. Morven returned once again, but this time he was no longer alone. Behind him appeared a colossal figure cloaked in living darkness, its towering form surrounded by countless drifting fragments of forgotten memories. Its eyes burned like deep crimson stars, and every step caused names, faces, and stories to fade from the temple walls. Seraphine bowed her head and whispered that this was Noctur, the Lord of the Silence, the ancient being who believed humanity became easier to control once it forgot the courage of those who came before. Noctur stretched out one enormous hand toward the chronicle and calmly offered Hamnet a terrible bargain. He promised to restore every forgotten memory, protect Hamnet's family forever, and end the suffering of innocent people if the young keeper simply surrendered the chronicle willingly. For a brief moment the offer seemed almost impossible to refuse, but as Hamnet looked around the temple he remembered every ordinary person whose kindness had filled the chronicle: the shepherd, the blacksmith, the little girl, the pilgrims, the monks, and countless unnamed souls whose goodness had never depended on reward. Quietly closing the chronicle, he refused the bargain without anger or hatred, saying that memories belong to everyone and could never become the possession of fear. The moment those words left his lips, the empty 4th circle upon the pedestal burst into radiant white light, and from its center slowly rose the 4th living seal of sacrifice, shining brighter than the eclipse itself as the Temple of the Last Flame echoed with the voices of every keeper who had protected the chronicle across countless generations, while Noctur watched in complete silence, knowing the final battle had now become inevitable. The moment the 4th living seal of sacrifice rose from the ancient pedestal, the Temple of the Last Flame trembled with a force unlike anything Hamnet had ever witnessed. Brilliant streams of white light merged with the golden, silver, and sapphire radiance of the other 3 seals, forming a magnificent circle around the young keeper as the Chronicle of Echoes floated into the air, its pages turning on their own while thousands of forgotten names appeared across every sheet in glowing letters. Voices filled the temple, not cries of fear, but the calm, hopeful whispers of generations whose acts of kindness had shaped the world without ever being remembered by history. Their courage flowed into the chronicle, making its light brighter than the crimson eclipse hanging above the valley. Noctur stood unmoving at the far end of the sanctuary, his enormous shadow stretching across the cracked stone floor as the darkness surrounding him twisted into towering creatures formed from erased memories, each wearing broken crowns, shattered armor, or faded robes from civilizations long forgotten. With a silent gesture, the creatures charged toward the center of the temple, determined to seize the chronicle before its awakening could be completed. Hamnet instinctively placed all 4 living seals into the carved circle surrounding the floating book, and at once a pillar of dazzling light erupted through the roof of the temple, piercing the eclipse itself. Ancient symbols hidden within every wall awakened, revealing the oath of the first keepers, which declared that memory could never truly die while even one heart chose compassion over fear. Seraphine and the restored guardians stood beside Hamnet, not with swords raised but with unwavering resolve, their belief strengthening the light of the seals. The shadow creatures crashed against the radiant barrier again and again, yet each strike only caused forgotten memories to burst free from their dark forms, returning to the chronicle as glowing threads of gold. Furious, Morven rushed forward with the repaired blade of oblivion, determined to destroy the chronicle before its final awakening, but when he reached the circle of light the four living seals responded together, revealing every forgotten act of goodness Morven himself had once performed before he surrendered to the silence centuries earlier. The memories overwhelmed him. He dropped the black blade, falling to his knees as tears filled eyes that had long forgotten how to weep. For the first time, he remembered his true name, the family he had once loved, and the promise he had broken when he chose fear instead of hope. Noctur watched silently, realizing that the greatest strength of the Chronicle was not its power to defeat enemies, but its ability to restore what darkness had stolen. Enraged, the Lord of the Silence finally stepped into the circle himself, causing the valley beyond the temple to shake as mountains echoed with thunder and rivers glowed beneath the fading eclipse. Yet as Hamnet lifted the fully awakened Chronicle before him, its pages stopped turning and one final sentence appeared in radiant golden letters. The greatest story is not the one remembered forever, but the one that inspires another to begin. At that very moment the temple was flooded with light brighter than dawn, and the true battle between the Keeper of Memories and the Lord of the Silence finally began. Light and shadow collided with such force that the Temple of the Last Flame seemed to exist outside of time itself. The brilliant radiance pouring from the fully awakened Chronicle of Echoes surged upward into the crimson eclipse, slowly breaking the circle of darkness that had covered the sky, while Noctur raised both hands and summoned an endless storm of forgotten memories, each one twisted into terrifying visions designed to fill every heart with despair. Around Hamnet appeared countless illusions showing kingdoms destroyed by greed, friendships broken by betrayal, families divided by hatred, and heroes who had failed despite every sacrifice they had made. The Lord of the Silence spoke with a voice as ancient as the mountains, insisting that hope always faded, mercy was always exploited, truth was always ignored, and sacrifice was always forgotten. For a single heartbeat the visions seemed real enough to shake Hamnet's confidence, but then the four living seals began shining together, reminding him of every ordinary person whose kindness had strengthened the Chronicle throughout his journey. He remembered the shepherd who shared his final loaf of bread, the young girl who rescued an injured horse, the blacksmith who repaired broken tools without accepting payment, the monks who cared for strangers, and the countless forgotten souls whose goodness had quietly transformed lives without expecting recognition. Their memories surrounded Hamnet like living stars, proving that Noctur's greatest deception was convincing people that small acts of compassion never mattered. With calm determination Hamnet lifted the Chronicle above his head, and every glowing page released thousands of golden threads that spread across the valley, reconnecting forgotten stories to the people who had once inspired them. Villages far beyond the mountains suddenly remembered ancient songs. Families recalled the names of long-lost ancestors. Children rediscovered legends that had nearly disappeared forever, and the light of remembrance swept across the land faster than the darkness could retreat. As the Chronicle restored memory after memory, cracks spread across Noctur's shadow-covered form, each fracture releasing brilliant light that had been imprisoned inside him since the beginning of the silence. Morven, now freed from centuries of corruption, stepped forward and willingly placed himself between Hamnet and Noctur, declaring that he would no longer serve fear. The Lord of the Silence unleashed a final wave of darkness powerful enough to shatter stone and silence the winds themselves, but instead of resisting with anger, Hamnet opened the Chronicle to its final unwritten page. The 4 living seals floated into the air and merged into a single radiant emblem that settled upon the last page, where new words appeared in brilliant gold. Every generation must choose whether to remember love or surrender to fear. Those words echoed across the valley, and the combined strength of every preserved memory burst outward in a wave of pure light. The eclipse dissolved, the skies turned clear for the first time in ages, and Noctur's immense form slowly unraveled into countless tiny sparks that drifted peacefully into the heavens, no longer consumed by darkness but restored as forgotten memories returning to the world they had once belonged to. Silence gave way to birdsong, rivers flowed with renewed life, flowers blossomed across the valley of ashes, and the temple of the last flame stood transformed into a sanctuary where future keepers would one day learn the importance of preserving humanity's greatest treasure. Not power, not wealth, but the stories of ordinary people whose compassion quietly changed the world. As the first rays of sunrise illuminated the horizon, Hamnet closed the chronicle with a peaceful smile, understanding that his journey as the keeper of memories had only just begun. Because every new generation would create stories worthy of being remembered, and it would forever be his calling to ensure that no act of kindness was ever lost to the silence again. Years passed after the fall of Noctur, and peace slowly returned to the kingdoms that had once stood on the edge of forgetting. The Chronicle of Echoes remained hidden within the restored Temple of the Last Flame, where its pages continued to write themselves whenever an ordinary person performed an extraordinary act of kindness without seeking praise. Hamnet, now known across the Hidden Order as the Keeper of Memories, never accepted titles or celebrations, choosing instead to travel quietly from village to village, listening to forgotten stories before they disappeared into time. Wherever he journeyed, people found themselves remembering songs their grandparents had sung, promises they had nearly broken, and friendships they believed had been lost forever. The 4 living seals rested within the temple, glowing softly as guardians of hope, mercy, truth, and sacrifice, yet one autumn evening the chronicle unexpectedly opened on its own. Unlike before, its pages did not reveal a forgotten hero or an ancient prophecy. Instead, a single line appeared in silver ink, something no keeper had ever seen. The silence has ended, but the hollow has awakened. Before Hamnet could understand the warning, the temple bells rang without anyone touching them, and every flame inside the sanctuary turned pale blue. Elias, though now very old, entered the chamber carrying a weathered scroll that had remained sealed since the age of the first keepers. Breaking the ancient seal, he revealed a forgotten truth. Long before Noctur was born, there had existed another force even older than the silence. It did not steal memories, it stole purpose. It was known only as the Hollow, a mysterious presence that whispered to people until they believed their kindness made no difference, causing hope to fade not through fear but through indifference. Elias explained that the first keepers had never defeated the Hollow, they had merely imprisoned it beyond the edge of dawn, a place where the world of memory and the world of dreams touched for only a few moments each century. With Noctur gone and the balance restored, the ancient prison had begun to weaken. As the warning echoed through the temple, the chronicle's pages suddenly filled with names that faded almost as quickly as they appeared. Not because they were being erased, but because those people had begun abandoning compassion of their own free will. Hamnet realized with quiet sorrow that this enemy could not simply be driven away with light, for the Hollow did not attack from the outside, it grew silently within hearts that stopped believing their choices mattered. Looking toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale light of dawn touched the mountains, Hamnet understood that a new journey was beginning, one unlike any faced by the keepers before him. This time the battle would not be fought against shadows, but against hopelessness itself, and the greatest challenge would be reminding the world that even the smallest act of kindness could still change the course of history. Hamnet left the Temple of the Last Flame before sunrise, carrying the Chronicle of Echoes once again, though this time the 4 living seals remained behind under the protection of the restored keepers, for Elias believed that the coming journey required wisdom rather than power. The silver words within the chronicle continued to appear and disappear like drifting mist, each fading name belonging to someone who had quietly given up believing that kindness could make a difference. As Hamnet traveled east toward the legendary Edge of Dawn, he noticed that the world itself had begun to change in subtle ways. Villages were peaceful, markets were full, and no great wars threatened the land, yet smiles had become rare. Neighbors passed one another without greeting, musicians no longer sang in the village squares, and children stopped asking the curious questions that once filled the air with laughter. There was no fear, no violence, and no visible darkness, only an unsettling emptiness that spread from heart to heart like an invisible winter. Along the road Hamnet met a young painter named Rowan sitting beside a river with a blank canvas. Rowan admitted that he had once dreamed of creating paintings that inspired people, but after years of hearing that his work changed nothing, he had stopped believing his efforts mattered. Hamnet did not lecture him or reveal the chronicle. Instead, he simply sat beside him until sunset, sharing stories of forgotten people whose smallest acts of kindness had echoed across generations. As they spoke, Rowan slowly picked up his brush once more and painted the river glowing beneath the evening sky. At that very moment, the chronicle shimmered, and Rowan's fading name returned in bright silver letters, proving that purpose could be restored when hope was rekindled. Yet far beyond the mountains, hidden beyond ordinary sight, the prison at the Edge of Dawn continued to crack. From within the endless white mist emerged a towering figure without a face or shadow, clothed in robes woven from pale smoke. It was neither cruel nor angry. It simply watched the world in complete silence. Around it drifted countless faint whispers repeating the same words into every passing breeze. Nothing you do will matter. Those whispers crossed forests, rivers, and cities, settling unnoticed inside weary hearts. As night fell, Hamnet stood upon a hill overlooking the distant horizon, where a thin line of silver light marked the forgotten boundary known as the Edge of Dawn. The chronicle closed on its own, and one final sentence appeared across its cover instead of its pages. To defeat the Hollow, you must first awaken the light that cannot be written. Hamnet looked toward the glowing horizon, realizing that every challenge he had overcome until now had merely prepared him for a journey where the greatest source of strength would no longer be ancient relics or hidden guardians, but the living courage of ordinary people choosing hope even when no one promised them victory. Hamnet continued toward the Edge of Dawn beneath skies that grew brighter with each passing day, yet the strange stillness covering the land deepened with every mile. Villages remained prosperous, harvests were plentiful, and the roads were safe, but the spirit of the people seemed to fade as though an invisible weight rested upon every heart. Farmers worked without singing, children no longer invented games beneath the old oak trees, and even storytellers who once gathered crowds around evening fires now sat quietly, convinced that no one wished to listen. Hamnet recognized the Hollow's influence spreading exactly as Elias had warned, not through destruction, but through the quiet belief that nothing was worth beginning because nothing could truly change. As he entered the ancient town of Evermere, he discovered its magnificent library standing abandoned despite shelves overflowing with priceless books. The elderly librarian, Miriam, explained with sorrow that people had stopped reading because they believed every story had already been told and every dream had already failed. Hamnet smiled gently and spent the entire afternoon reading aloud from the chronicle, not revealing its magical pages, but sharing the forgotten lives of ordinary men and women whose simple choices had transformed countless others. One story told of a baker who secretly fed hungry children during a harsh winter, another of a ferryman who crossed a dangerous river every night to carry strangers to safety, and another of a teacher who inspired generations without ever becoming famous. As each tale reached its end, listeners quietly gathered outside the library. Children sat on the stone steps, travelers paused beside the open windows, merchants closed their stalls early, and for the first time in many months laughter echoed through Evermere's streets. Inside the chronicle, dozens of fading silver names slowly brightened once again, proving that purpose could awaken wherever hope was shared. Yet far beyond the town, the faceless presence known as the Hollow stood upon the mist-covered cliffs of the edge of dawn, watching the distant lights of Evermere with silent curiosity. It did not rage or strike back. Instead, countless pale whispers drifted outward across the wind, seeking hearts burdened by loneliness, disappointment, and regret. That night Hamnet climbed the highest tower of the library and looked toward the silver horizon, where the first rays of dawn touched the ancient mist surrounding the Hollow's prison. The chronicle suddenly opened by itself, but every page remained completely blank except for a single line glowing at the very center. The light that cannot be written lives not inside this book, but inside those who choose to become another person's reason to hope. Hamnet closed the chronicle with quiet understanding. The greatest power the keepers had ever protected had never truly been hidden within magical relics or forgotten temples. It had always existed in ordinary people whose kindness inspired others to continue believing. And with that realization he stepped down from the tower at sunrise, ready to journey beyond the edge of dawn itself, where the Hollow patiently awaited the one keeper who finally understood that the brightest light in the world could never be captured upon any page, because it was written instead within the hearts of those who refused to surrender hope. Beyond the final hills of Evermere, the world slowly transformed into a land unlike any Hamnet had ever crossed. The trees became pale silver, rivers reflected the sky with perfect clarity, and the wind carried no sound except the distant whisper of dawn. At the edge of this silent landscape stood a magnificent arch of white stone known only in ancient keeper legends as the Gate of First Light. No walls surrounded it, no guards protected it, and yet its presence filled the air with quiet power. As Hamnet stepped beneath the arch, the Chronicle of Echoes closed by itself, its golden cover becoming completely still, as though even the ancient book could not guide him beyond this point. A gentle voice echoed through the endless mist, neither welcoming nor warning him, simply saying that every keeper reached this place alone because no memory, no relic, and no prophecy could decide what came next. Hamnet continued forward until he arrived at a vast sea of shimmering white clouds stretching farther than the horizon, where narrow bridges of light appeared beneath each step before fading away behind him. At the center of the endless expanse stood the Hollow, its faceless form surrounded by drifting silver mist. It neither threatened Hamnet nor raised a weapon. Instead, it calmly asked a single question: if the world forgets your name tomorrow, would you still choose kindness today? The words settled heavily within the silence. Hamnet thought of the shepherd who had shared his last loaf of bread, the blacksmith who had repaired broken tools without reward, the pilgrims at the monastery, Rowan the painter, Miriam the librarian, and countless ordinary people whose names history would never celebrate. None of them had acted because they expected to be remembered. They had simply believed that another person's life mattered. Looking directly toward the Hollow, Hamnet answered with quiet certainty that kindness never depended upon recognition because its greatest reward was the hope it awakened in someone else. The moment those words were spoken, the endless bridges of light beneath his feet expanded across the sea of clouds, reaching far into the distance. For the first time, the Hollow moved. Its featureless face began to crack like fragile glass, and faint rays of warm golden light escaped from within. The ancient presence had not been born from evil but from the forgotten doubts of countless generations, growing stronger whenever people abandoned hope and weaker whenever they chose compassion without expecting anything in return. Around Hamnet, thousands of glowing figures slowly appeared, echoes of the forgotten heroes whose stories had filled the chronicle through the centuries. They did not speak. They simply stood together, their silent presence proving that even unnoticed goodness could endure beyond time itself. The mist surrounding the hollow slowly dissolved, revealing a lonely figure hidden inside the ancient shell of emptiness, as though the hollow had once been a keeper who had forgotten why the journey had begun. Before Hamnet could take another step, the sky above the edge of dawn burst into brilliant gold as a new page unexpectedly appeared inside the closed chronicle without anyone opening it. Across that page, written in radiant letters brighter than the sunrise, were the words, "Every ending becomes the beginning of another story when even one heart chooses hope." As the first full light of dawn spread across the endless horizon, Hamnet realized that the greatest battle had never been against darkness itself, but against the quiet belief that goodness was meaningless, and by refusing that belief he had begun restoring not only forgotten memories, but the very purpose that allowed humanity to dream of a brighter tomorrow. At sunrise the sea was as calm as polished glass, reflecting the brilliant white beacon that continued shining from the ancient lighthouse long after the storm had passed. Standing upon the weathered harbor, Elion looked toward the endless horizon where the compass pointed unwaveringly across waters that no keeper had crossed for centuries. Aldrin handed him a small wooden boat unlike any ordinary vessel. Though simple in appearance, its hull bore the emblem of the first keepers carved into the oak, and its white sail carried the symbol of an open book surrounded by 4 stars. "This is the Dawnwind," Aldrin said softly. "It has never followed the currents of the sea. It follows the direction of hope." With a grateful smile, Elion stepped aboard, and without wind or oars the little vessel quietly glided into the open ocean. Days passed beneath brilliant skies and silent nights filled with countless stars. Strange islands appeared in the distance before vanishing into mist, while schools of silverfish swam beside the boat as though guiding its course. Every evening the crystal lantern glowed a little brighter, responding to distant acts of perseverance recorded by the chronicle far away beneath the hidden library. On the 7th morning, thick white fog surrounded the Dawnwind until the world beyond the deck disappeared completely. From within the mist emerged soft voices speaking in many languages, each repeating the same words, "Turn back. Your journey changes nothing." Elion recognized the lingering whispers of the hollow, still searching for hearts willing to surrender. Closing his eyes, he remembered Ashbrook, Leora, Rowan, the lighthouse keeper Aldrin, and the countless ordinary people who had rediscovered purpose through small acts of kindness. Instead of answering the whispers with fear, he quietly lit the crystal lantern. Its gentle silver flame spread across the fog without burning it, revealing a hidden passage through the mist. Beyond it rose an island unlike any marked upon ancient maps. Towering white cliffs surrounded a peaceful valley where enormous white oak trees covered the hillsides, their leaves shimmering like morning light. At the center of the island stood a magnificent circular sanctuary built from pale stone, untouched by time. As Elion stepped ashore, hundreds of white birds lifted into the sky together, filling the air with graceful wings. The great doors of the sanctuary slowly opened, revealing walls covered with countless names, not of kings or conquerors, but of ordinary people whose unseen kindness had changed the lives of others across generations. Then, from the heart of the sanctuary, a calm voice echoed through the silent hall. "Welcome, Keeper," it said. "You have reached the island of first stories, where every journey begins not with greatness, but with a single choice to care." Elion stepped forward with quiet determination, unaware that the greatest secret preserved since Hamnet's age waited within the sanctuary, ready to reveal why the Chronicle of Echoes had chosen him and what destiny awaited the next keeper of memories. The brilliant white flame burning atop the forgotten lighthouse could be seen from miles away, its steady light cutting through the morning mist like a silent invitation that had waited centuries to be answered. Guided by the compass, Elion crossed rolling grasslands, quiet fishing villages, and rugged cliffs until he reached the lonely coastline where the ancient tower stood. Waves crashed endlessly against black rocks below, yet the lighthouse itself showed no signs of decay despite having been abandoned for generations. Its great wooden door slowly opened before Elion could even touch it, revealing a spiral staircase lined with faded paintings of sailors rescuing strangers, healers tending to the injured, and children helping one another during fierce storms. Every image celebrated ordinary courage rather than famous victories. At the summit he discovered an elderly lighthouse keeper named Aldrin, whose silver beard reached almost to his waist and whose calm eyes reflected the sea beyond the windows. Aldrin revealed that the lighthouse had never existed merely to guide ships through dangerous waters. Hidden within its light was the beacon of resolve, an ancient gift created by the first keepers to encourage those who had lost faith in themselves. Whenever someone chose to continue despite failure, grief, or doubt, the beacon burned a little brighter, but for many years its light had weakened because too many people believed giving up was easier than trying again. As Elion listened, the beacon suddenly flickered, and the chronicle far beneath the hidden library responded by revealing dozens of names written in pale silver, each belonging to someone standing on the edge of abandoning a dream that could have changed another life. Aldrin handed Elion a small crystal lantern, explaining that it would not shine through ordinary fire but only through genuine determination. To awaken it, Elion would have to help others rediscover the strength to continue when success seemed impossible. Before another word could be spoken, a violent storm gathered without warning, sending enormous waves crashing against the cliffs while a fishing boat struggled desperately in the raging sea. Without hesitation Elion and Aldrin raced to the top of the tower, reigniting the ancient beacon together. The great white light pierced the darkness, guiding the frightened sailors safely through the storm and back to shore. As the final boat reached the harbor, the crystal lantern in Elion's hands began glowing with a warm silver flame for the very first time. At that same moment, every pale name inside the chronicle brightened into radiant gold, proving that one person's decision to persevere could inspire countless others never to surrender. Aldrin smiled quietly and placed the glowing lantern into Elion's satchel, saying that every keeper carried not only memories of the past but also the courage to illuminate the future. As dawn broke over the calm sea, the beacon shone brighter than it had in centuries, its light stretching far beyond the horizon where unknown lands waited, and the compass slowly turned toward the open ocean, hinting that the next story would begin across waters no keeper had crossed since the age of Hamnet himself. As Ashbrook slowly flourished once again, Elion prepared to continue his journey, believing his work there had come to an end. Yet on the morning of his departure, the compass in his satchel began spinning rapidly before settling toward a narrow path leading into the Whispering Hills, a place where few travelers ventured because strange echoes often carried voices from the past. Curious, Elion followed the winding trail until he reached the ruins of an ancient watchtower overlooking a forgotten valley. At its summit sat a young woman named Leora, quietly sketching the landscape into a worn journal whose pages were almost completely blank. She admitted that she had once dreamed of becoming a historian, preserving the lives of ordinary people so they would never be forgotten, but after years of hearing that only kings, battles, and famous names mattered, she had abandoned her dream and left every story unfinished. As she spoke, the chronicle hidden far away beneath the chapel shimmered faintly, and another page began turning silver. Elion realized that the hollow still left behind quiet traces wherever people surrendered their purpose. Instead of convincing Leora with grand speeches, he invited her to walk through nearby villages with him. Together they listened to an old fisherman describe how a stranger had once saved him during a violent storm, watched a village healer spend sleepless nights caring for the sick without expecting reward, and met a shepherd whose faithful dog had protected lost children through a freezing winter. Leora carefully wrote each story into her journal, and with every completed page her eyes grew brighter. She slowly understood that history was not built only by rulers and conquerors but by countless unseen people whose compassion shaped generations without recognition. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the distant hills, the wind carried thousands of white leaves through the valley, surrounding the ruined watchtower in a quiet circle of light. Deep within the hidden library, the Chronicle of Echoes responded by writing Leora's name in radiant gold beside the words, "The one who remembered the unremembered." Elias smiled as he watched the glowing page appear, recognizing that the greatest strength of the new keeper was not defeating darkness but awakening purpose in others. Before Elian and Leora parted ways, he gave her a single white oak seed and asked her to plant it wherever she discovered a forgotten story worth preserving. She promised she would, believing that every tree would stand as a living reminder that no act of kindness was ever too small to deserve remembrance. As Elian resumed his journey beneath the starlit sky, the compass pointed farther east than ever before, toward lands that no keeper had visited for centuries. At the same moment, beyond the distant sea where the horizon met the first light of dawn, a forgotten lighthouse that had stood dark for generations suddenly illuminated itself with a brilliant white flame, as though answering an ancient call that only the Chronicle of Echoes could hear, inviting the keeper toward another chapter waiting to be written. The road to Ashbrook wound through quiet meadows, gentle rivers, and rolling hills where the first light of morning painted the countryside in shades of gold, yet the farther Elian traveled, the more unusual the silence became. Farmers worked their fields without greeting one another, children played alone instead of together, and even the birds seemed to avoid the village as though they sensed a sorrow that words could not describe. When Elian finally crossed the old stone bridge leading into Ashbrook, he found a place untouched by war or disaster, its cottages neat, gardens blooming, and streets clean, yet every face carried the same weary expression. Neighbors closed their doors before sunset, merchants spoke only when necessary, and old friends passed one another without exchanging a smile. The compass Elias had given him trembled softly, its needle pointing toward the center of the village square where an ancient white oak stood with most of its branches bare despite the warmth of spring. Sitting beneath the tree was an elderly woman named Clara, who quietly explained that years earlier a misunderstanding between two respected families had divided the entire village. No one remembered exactly how the quarrel had begun, but everyone remembered choosing a side. Over time, pride had replaced friendship, and silence had become a habit passed from parents to children. That evening Elian did not reveal that he was a keeper, nor did he speak of the chronicle hidden far beneath the forest. Instead, he walked from house to house offering small acts of help, repairing a broken water wheel for a farmer, carrying firewood for an elderly widow, fixing a child's wooden cart, and quietly encouraging strangers to thank one another for even the smallest kindness. At first nothing seemed to change, but as the days passed, tiny moments began spreading across Ashbrook. A baker left fresh bread outside the home of a sick neighbor before sunrise. Two children from rival families started playing together beside the river. A carpenter repaired the roof of a cottage without asking for payment. One evening the village bell, silent for many months, rang again as people gathered in the square for the first shared meal anyone could remember. Beneath the white oak, fresh green leaves slowly appeared upon branches that had seemed lifeless only days before. At that very moment, deep within the hidden library, the Chronicle of Echoes opened by itself, and every silver page bearing the name, Ashbrook, turned brilliant gold. Elias smiled quietly as he watched the transformation, knowing the new keeper had understood the lesson Hamnet had once learned long ago, that the greatest victories were often so small they passed unnoticed by history, yet they carried the power to change generations. As the stars filled the peaceful night sky above Ashbrook, Elian planted the white oak seed beside the ancient tree. The earth glowed softly for a brief moment before becoming still again, and a gentle breeze carried the leaves through the village streets as though the world itself was celebrating a story that would never be famous, yet would be remembered forever where it mattered most, in the hearts of those whose lives had been changed by simple acts of kindness. The soft echo of the ancient bells lingered through the hidden library as Elias welcomed Elian into the Hall of Living Stories, where countless shelves stretched endlessly beneath vaulted stone ceilings illuminated by floating lanterns that required neither flame nor oil. Unlike Hamnet's first visit years earlier, the library no longer felt like a place recovering from darkness. It breathed with quiet life, every glowing book representing a new story of courage, forgiveness, generosity, or hope created by ordinary people across the kingdoms. Elias explained that after Hamnet's final journey the chronicle had changed forever. It no longer waited for history to preserve kindness, it recorded compassion the very moment it transformed another life. As they walked through the endless aisles, Elian noticed several books fading to silver instead of gold. Concerned, he asked whether the silence had returned, but Elias gently shook his head. The danger was different now. Memories were safe, yet many stories remained unfinished because people often abandoned hope before discovering the difference they could make. The chronicle could preserve a completed act of goodness, but it could never force anyone to choose it. Reaching the center of the library, Elias placed an ancient map upon a circular stone table. New paths had appeared since Hamnet's time, leading not toward hidden temples or forgotten fortresses, but toward villages, towns, lonely mountain homes, and distant islands where people quietly struggled with fear, doubt, and loneliness. The work of a keeper has changed, Elias said with a peaceful smile. You are not being sent to defeat monsters. You are being sent to remind people that they are capable of becoming heroes in their own ordinary lives. At that moment the chronicle opened by itself, and a single page filled with glowing words describing a remote village called Ashbrook, where neighbors had slowly stopped trusting one another after years of misunderstanding and silence. No war had touched the village, no curse haunted its streets, and no shadow creature waited beyond its gates. Yet everyday kindness became a little rarer, and every evening another silver page appeared inside the chronicle. Elias handed Elian a small leather satchel much like the one Hamnet had once carried, though this one contained no magical relics, only a simple journal, a compass that pointed toward fading hope, and a white oak seed. These will be enough, Elias whispered. As Elian climbed the familiar stone staircase toward the world above, he glanced back one final time. The chronicle shimmered softly before revealing a new sentence across its open page. Every generation inherits the future written by the kindness it chooses today. Carrying those words in his heart, Elian stepped into the morning sunlight, unaware that his first journey as the new keeper of memories had already begun, not with a battle against darkness, but with a single opportunity to restore hope where it had quietly begun to disappear. Many years after Hamnet quietly disappeared from the eyes of the world, stories about the mysterious keeper of memories became little more than gentle legends whispered beside fireplaces on cold winter nights. Most people believed the tales were only myths created to teach children the value of kindness, while only a handful of elderly keepers knew that every word had once been true. Deep beneath the abandoned chapel, the hidden library remained silent, its endless shelves patiently waiting beneath layers of time, and at the very center the Chronicle of Echoes rested upon its ancient pedestal, untouched yet alive, as its pages slowly filled with new stories written by unseen hands whenever an act of selfless courage changed another life. One spring morning, in a peaceful village surrounded by fields of wildflowers, a curious 14-year-old apprentice named Elian wandered farther into the woods than anyone else dared to travel. Fascinated by forgotten places, he spent his days repairing broken clocks, collecting weathered maps, and listening to old travelers who claimed the forest remembered every footstep ever taken beneath its branches. While exploring the roots of an enormous white oak unlike any tree he had ever seen, Elion noticed a small wooden key resting inside the earth as though it had been waiting there for generations. The moment his fingers touched the key, a warm pulse of golden light flowed through the forest, causing birds to fall silent and thousands of white leaves to swirl gently through the air without a single breeze. Drawn by a feeling he could not explain, Elion followed the glowing path until he reached the forgotten stone chapel hidden among ancient trees. Though the building appeared abandoned, the old wooden key fit perfectly into a weathered iron lock beneath the cracked altar. With a deep rumble, the hidden doorway slowly opened, revealing the long-forgotten staircase descending into darkness. Carrying only a small lantern and his endless curiosity, Elion stepped downward until he entered the magnificent underground library, where countless books stretched beyond the horizon beneath softly glowing lights. At the center of the endless hall stood the Chronicle of Echoes, exactly as Hamnet had left it many years before. As Elion approached, the ancient book opened by itself, revealing not stories from the distant past but a single sentence written in brilliant golden letters. Every keeper begins as someone who simply cared enough to ask why. Before Elion could understand those words, quiet footsteps echoed among the shelves. Emerging from the shadows was an elderly man with kind eyes, leaning upon a familiar ash wood staff. It was Elias, now older than ever yet carrying the same calm smile that had once welcomed Hamnet into the hidden order. Looking at the young apprentice, Elias gently nodded and said, "The Chronicle has chosen again." At that moment, the candles throughout the library burned brighter than they had in decades. Ancient bells hidden within the stone walls rang softly, and far beyond the forest another white oak released its blossoms into the wind, carrying them across the kingdoms as though the world itself had recognized that the age of one keeper had ended, and the journey of another had just begun. As the first rays of the new dawn spread across the endless sea of clouds, the world beneath the edge of dawn began to change in ways no keeper had ever witnessed. Villages once touched by quiet emptiness slowly awakened with renewed life. Bells rang from distant churches without being summoned, children filled the streets with laughter once more, musicians reopened forgotten songbooks, and artists returned to unfinished canvases they had abandoned years before. Yet Hamnet knew the journey was far from over, because hope was never a victory won forever. It was a choice that every generation had to make again. The Chronicle of Echoes glowed gently in his hands, and when he opened it, the pages no longer contained only stories from the past. Blank pages now waited for the future, ready to record acts of kindness that had not yet happened. Elias appeared beside him, older than ever but smiling with quiet pride, explaining that the Chronicle had entered a new age. It no longer needed a guardian who merely protected memories. It needed one who inspired new ones to be created. Together they descended from the edge of dawn and returned to the valleys below, where Hamnet refused every celebration offered in his honor, believing that the greatest victories belong to ordinary people rather than heroes. Instead, he traveled from town to town planting small white oak saplings, each grown from seeds gathered near the Temple of the Last Flame. He told no one about their hidden meaning. Yet wherever a tree took root, strangers slowly became neighbors, old quarrels found peaceful endings, forgotten promises were fulfilled, and children gathered beneath the branches to tell stories that would one day become memories of their own. Years passed, and the white oaks spread across the kingdoms until travelers began calling them the Trees of Dawn, believing they had always existed, never realizing they marked the footsteps of the Keeper of Memories. One quiet evening Hamnet returned alone to the abandoned chapel where his extraordinary journey had first begun. The hidden library beneath the earth still stood untouched, but something had changed. Shelves once filled with ancient volumes now contained countless blank books waiting for new stories. At the center of the hall the Chronicle closed by itself, and a final message appeared upon its cover. The greatest keeper is not the one who remembers every story, but the one who inspires others to create stories worth remembering. Hamnet smiled, gently placed the chronicle upon its stone pedestal, and stepped back without regret. The glowing book no longer needed to follow him, because its true pages were now written in the lives of ordinary people choosing compassion every single day. As he climbed the ancient staircase into the evening light, the library slowly disappeared beneath the earth once again, waiting patiently for another soul whose heart valued kindness above glory. High above the peaceful countryside, a flock of white birds crossed the golden sky, carrying the promise that every ending was only the beginning of another tale, while somewhere, in a distant village untouched by history, a curious young child discovered an old wooden key half buried beneath the roots of a white oak tree, smiled with quiet wonder, and unknowingly took the first step toward a new chapter that had yet to be written. Beyond the northern mountains, where the air grew crisp and the valleys echoed with the sound of distant waterfalls, Elion followed the compass toward a forgotten settlement known as Frosthaven. Once celebrated as a meeting place for scholars, craftsmen, and travelers from every corner of the world, the valley had gradually become isolated after harsh winters closed its mountain passes year after year. When Elion entered the village, he found its people surviving rather than truly living. Workshops stood locked, the schoolhouse had fallen silent, and the once busy marketplace had become little more than an empty square where only a handful of merchants quietly traded essential goods. Yet the chronicle gently pulsed inside his satchel, reminding him that every quiet place still held stories waiting to be awakened. While exploring the village, Elion met a young schoolteacher named Anya sitting alone inside the abandoned classroom. The walls were covered with faded maps and unfinished lessons, while rows of empty wooden desks gathered dust beneath the afternoon light. Anya confessed that the children had stopped attending because their families believed education served little purpose in a village that seemed forgotten by the rest of the world. She had nearly packed away her books forever. Elion listened without interrupting before asking her a simple question. If only one child came tomorrow, would you still teach? The question lingered in the silent room. After a long pause, Anya smiled faintly and answered that she would. The next morning she opened the classroom door once again. At first only one little girl arrived carrying a worn notebook. Then another child appeared, followed by two brothers, and before the sun reached its highest point the classroom was filled with curious faces eager to learn stories, mathematics, music, and the history of ordinary people whose courage had quietly shaped the world. Outside, parents who had gathered to watch slowly began repairing the neglected school building together. Carpenters fixed broken windows, painters restored faded walls, gardeners filled the courtyard with flowers, and retired scholars volunteered to teach skills they had almost forgotten themselves. As laughter echoed through Frosthaven once again, the chronicle wrote Anya's name in radiant gold beside the words, "The one who opened the door again." High above the valley, sunlight broke through the lingering winter clouds, covering the snow with a brilliant golden glow. Elion quietly planted another white oak seed beside the schoolhouse, and before evening its young branches stretched toward the sky, becoming a living promise that knowledge shared with kindness would continue growing long after any single teacher's voice had fallen silent. As twilight settled over the peaceful village, the compass turned once more, pointing toward the distant western desert where an ancient caravan route had vanished from every map. At the same moment, the crystal lantern shimmered with an unfamiliar amber light, and the chronicle revealed a new line across its pages. The greatest path is often rediscovered by the first person willing to take the forgotten road. With those words resting in his heart, Elion thanked the people of Frosthaven and began another journey, knowing that somewhere beyond the endless sands another forgotten story was patiently waiting to be remembered. The dawnwind sailed eastward beneath a sky washed in pale morning light, carrying Elion away from the island of first stories with the seed of beginnings safely hidden inside his satchel. The sea remained unusually calm, as though even the waves understood the importance of the small glowing seed entrusted to the young keeper. For several days the crystal lantern shone with a gentle silver flame, guiding the boat toward the mountain kingdom Lyra had shown him. At last the jagged peaks appeared beyond the horizon, their snow-covered summits rising above thick clouds that never seemed to move. As Elion climbed the winding stone road leading into the kingdom, he found magnificent halls, beautiful gardens, and grand libraries that had once been filled with music and celebration. Now every street lay strangely quiet. Painters had abandoned their easels, musicians left their instruments untouched, and sculptors had covered unfinished works with cloth, convinced that nothing they created would ever matter. The silence carried no anger or fear, only resignation. Walking through the capital, Elion met a young violin maker named Soren sitting alone inside a dusty workshop surrounded by beautifully carved instruments that no one wished to play. Soren quietly admitted that he had spent years crafting violins, yet after hearing endless criticism and seeing little appreciation, he had decided to burn his final creation before leaving the craft forever. Elion did not argue. Instead, he asked Soren to play one last melody before making his decision. Though reluctant, Soren lifted the unfinished violin and drew the bow across its strings. The first notes echoed softly through the empty street, then drifted into nearby homes where people paused to listen. An elderly woman opened her window and began singing words she had not remembered in decades. A child quietly joined the melody on an old wooden flute. Soon another musician appeared with a harp, followed by a drummer, a choir of villagers, and dancers who had long forgotten the joy of performing. What began as one hesitant melody became a celebration filling every corner of the city. High above the kingdom, the heavy clouds slowly parted, allowing warm sunlight to pour across the rooftops for the first time in many years. Deep beneath the forgotten chapel, the Chronicle of Echoes responded by writing Soren's name in brilliant gold beneath the words, "The one who played before he believed." Elion smiled, understanding that courage often arrived after the first step rather than before it. That evening he quietly planted the seed of beginnings in the center of the kingdom's silent square. The earth glowed softly as delicate roots spread beneath the ancient stones, and by sunrise a young white oak had already emerged, its leaves shimmering with silver and gold. People gathered beneath its branches not because they had been told to, but because they once again believed their gifts could bring hope to others. As Elion prepared to continue his travels, the compass turned toward a distant valley hidden beyond the northern mountains, while the crystal lantern burned brighter than ever before. The chronicle revealed one final message before the page turned. Every heart awakened becomes a light for another still waiting in the darkness. Carrying those words with him, Elion set out once more, unaware that another forgotten soul was already waiting for the keeper's arrival, and that the next chapter of the chronicle had quietly begun long before their paths would finally cross. The morning after Lyra revealed the true purpose of the keepers, the island of first stories awakened beneath a sky painted with brilliant shades of gold and sapphire. Gentle winds carried thousands of glowing leaves from the great tree across the sea, each one searching for a heart that had nearly forgotten how to hope. Elion stood beneath the ancient branches, holding the white oak branch Lyra had entrusted to him, when the entire sanctuary began humming with a soft, harmonious sound. One by one, the stone pillars surrounding the chamber illuminated, and beneath every carved name appeared a second line that had never existed before. Instead of describing what each person had done, the new inscriptions revealed the lives that had been transformed because of those simple acts of kindness. A child once saved from hunger had grown into a healer who rescued hundreds during a terrible plague. A lonely traveler welcomed into a stranger's home had later founded a village where no one was ever left without shelter. A forgotten teacher had inspired generations of students, whose discoveries changed distant kingdoms. Elion realized that no act of compassion ever ended with the person who first performed it. Every choice created another, like ripples spreading endlessly across a quiet lake. Lyra smiled as she watched him understand. This, she said softly, is the living chain. The chronicle records a single story, but the world carries its echoes forever. As her words faded, the great tree released one radiant seed unlike the others. It floated gently into Elion's hands, glowing with a warm light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lyra explained that this was the seed of beginnings, the final gift of the island of first stories. It could never be planted by a keeper for themselves. It would bloom only when given freely to someone who had lost all faith in their own future. Before Elion could ask another question, the crystal dome above the sanctuary shimmered, revealing a vision of a distant mountain kingdom wrapped in heavy clouds. Once famous for music, art, and celebration, the kingdom had slowly fallen silent as people abandoned their dreams, believing failure was stronger than hope. The chronicle, resting far away beneath the hidden library, suddenly opened on its own, and a single golden sentence appeared across its pages. Every new beginning is born from someone who refuses to let another person lose hope. Lyra gently placed her hand upon Elion's shoulder and told him that his greatest journey was no longer about discovering forgotten places but about helping forgotten hearts remember their own light. With the seed of beginnings safely protected inside his satchel, the young keeper walked back toward the peaceful shore where the dawnwind waited upon calm waters. As the boat quietly drifted away from the island, the great tree shimmered beneath the morning sun, and thousands of white birds rose into the sky together, carrying the promise that Hamnet's legacy would continue not through monuments or legends, but through ordinary people choosing compassion again and again, until every corner of the world held a story worth remembering. The great doors of the sanctuary of first stories closed silently behind Elion, and the sound echoed through the vast circular chamber like the turning of an ancient page. Sunlight streamed through a crystal dome high above, illuminating thousands of names carved into white stone pillars, each belonging to an ordinary person whose quiet compassion had changed another life forever. As Elion walked between the pillars, he noticed that no dates, titles, or achievements accompanied the names. Only a single sentence appeared beneath each one, describing one simple act of kindness that had echoed through generations. A farmer who planted an extra field so hungry families would never go without food. A teacher who remained in a remote village until every child learned to read. A sailor who rescued strangers during a violent storm, never revealing his own name. The more Elion read, the more he understood that greatness had never belonged to the powerful alone, it belonged equally to those who chose goodness when no one was watching. At the center of the sanctuary stood a magnificent tree unlike any he had ever seen. Its trunk shimmered with silver light, its branches stretched high into the crystal dome, and every leaf glowed softly as though holding a living memory. Resting beneath the tree was a stone seat carved with the emblem of the first keepers. As Elion approached, the crystal lantern and the compass both began shining together, while the Chronicle of Echoes, though far away in the hidden library, answered with a pulse of warm golden light that could somehow be felt across the sea. The air grew perfectly still before a gentle figure stepped from behind the radiant tree. Clothed in flowing white robes woven with threads of gold, the woman carried neither staff nor weapon, only a small branch of white oak. She introduced herself as Lyra, the first storykeeper, the guardian who had planted the very first tree of dawn before the chronicle had ever been created. Smiling warmly, she explained that the chronicle was never meant to be the source of hope. It was only a mirror reflecting the kindness already living within humanity. The true purpose of every keeper was not to protect a magical book but to awaken the light hidden inside ordinary hearts. She then placed the white oak branch into Elion's hands. Instantly, The great tree released thousands of glowing leaves that drifted across the sanctuary, each leaf transforming into a tiny point of golden light before floating toward distant lands beyond the sea. Lyra quietly revealed that every light would find someone who stood at a crossroads between giving up and choosing hope, because the world would always need people willing to become the beginning of someone else's better story. As the final leaf disappeared into the horizon, a new inscription slowly appeared upon the central pillar of the sanctuary. The chronicle remembers the past, but the keeper inspires the future. Elion looked around the peaceful hall with quiet understanding, realizing that Hamnet's legacy had never truly ended. It had simply grown from one keeper into countless ordinary people whose compassion continued writing the world's greatest story, one selfless choice at a time. While far beyond the island another white oak seed took root in distant soil, signaling that a new journey had already begun for someone who did not yet know their name would one day be remembered among the first stories. The great doors of the sanctuary of first stories closed silently behind Elion, and the sound echoed through the vast circular chamber like the turning of an ancient page. Sunlight streamed through a crystal dome high above, illuminating thousands of names carved into white stone pillars, each belonging to an ordinary person whose quiet compassion had changed another life forever. As Elion walked between the pillars, he noticed that no dates, titles, or achievements accompanied the names. Only a single sentence appeared beneath each one, describing one simple act of kindness that had echoed through generations. A farmer who planted an extra field so hungry families would never go without food. A teacher who remained in a remote village until every child learned to read. A sailor who rescued strangers during a violent storm, never revealing his own name. The more Elion read, the more he understood that greatness had never belonged to the powerful alone, it belonged equally to those who chose goodness when no one was watching. At the center of the sanctuary stood a magnificent tree unlike any he had ever seen. Its trunk shimmered with silver light, its branches stretched high into the crystal dome, and every leaf glowed softly as though holding a living memory. Resting beneath the tree was a stone seat carved with the emblem of the first keepers. As Elion approached, the crystal lantern and the compass both began shining together, while the Chronicle of Echoes, though far away in the hidden library, answered with a pulse of warm golden light that could somehow be felt across the sea. The air grew perfectly still before a gentle figure stepped from behind the radiant tree. Clothed in flowing white robes woven with threads of gold, the woman carried neither staff nor weapon, only a small branch of white oak. She introduced herself as Lyra, the first storekeeper, the guardian who had planted the very first tree of dawn before the chronicle had ever been created. Smiling warmly, she explained that the chronicle was never meant to be the source of hope. It was only a mirror reflecting the kindness already living within humanity. The true purpose of every keeper was not to protect a magical book but to awaken the light hidden inside ordinary hearts. She then placed the white oak branch into Elion's hands. Instantly, the great tree released thousands of glowing leaves that drifted across the sanctuary, each leaf transforming into a tiny point of golden light before floating toward distant lands beyond the sea. Lyra quietly revealed that every light would find someone who stood at a crossroads between giving up and choosing hope, because the world would always need people willing to become the beginning of someone else's better story. As the final leaf disappeared into the horizon, a new inscription slowly appeared upon the central pillar of the sanctuary. The chronicle remembers the past, but the keeper inspires the future. Elion looked around the peaceful hall with quiet understanding, realizing that Hamnet's legacy had never truly ended. It had simply grown from one keeper into countless ordinary people whose compassion continued writing the world's greatest story, one selfless choice at a time. While far beyond the island another white oak seed took root in distant soil, signaling that a new journey had already begun for someone who did not yet know their name would one day be remembered among the first stories. Beyond the northern mountains, Where the air grew crisp and the valleys echoed with the sound of distant waterfalls, Elion followed the compass toward a forgotten settlement known as Frosthaven. Once celebrated as a meeting place for scholars, craftsmen, and travelers from every corner of the world, the valley had gradually become isolated after harsh winters closed its mountain passes year after year. When Elion entered the village, he found its people surviving rather than truly living. Workshops stood locked, the schoolhouse had fallen silent, and the once busy marketplace had become little more than an empty square where only a handful of merchants quietly traded essential goods. Yet the chronicle gently pulsed inside his satchel, reminding him that every quiet place still held stories waiting to be awakened. While exploring the village, Elion met a young schoolteacher named Anya sitting alone inside the abandoned classroom. The walls were covered with faded maps and unfinished lessons, while rows of empty wooden desks gathered dust beneath the afternoon light. Anya confessed that the children had stopped attending because their families believed education served little purpose in a village that seemed forgotten by the rest of the world. She had nearly packed away her books forever. Elion listened without interrupting before asking her a simple question. If only one child came tomorrow, would you still teach? The question lingered in the silent room. After a long pause, Anya smiled faintly and answered that she would. The next morning she opened the classroom door once again. At first only one little girl arrived carrying a worn notebook. Then another child appeared, followed by two brothers, and before the sun reached its highest point the classroom was filled with curious faces eager to learn stories, mathematics, music, and the history of ordinary people whose courage had quietly shaped the world. Outside, parents who had gathered to watch slowly began repairing the neglected school building together. Carpenters fixed broken windows, painters restored faded walls, gardeners filled the courtyard with flowers, and retired scholars volunteered to teach skills they had almost forgotten themselves. As laughter echoed through Frosthaven once again, the chronicle wrote Anya's name in radiant gold beside the words, "The one who opened the door again." High above the valley, sunlight broke through the lingering winter clouds, covering the snow with a brilliant golden glow. Elion quietly planted another white oak seed beside the schoolhouse, and before evening its young branches stretched toward the sky, becoming a living promise that knowledge shared with kindness would continue growing long after any single teacher's voice had fallen silent. As twilight settled over the peaceful village, the compass turned once more, pointing toward the distant western desert where an ancient caravan route had vanished from every map. At the same moment, the crystal lantern shimmered with an unfamiliar amber light, and the chronicle revealed a new line across its pages. The greatest path is often rediscovered by the first person willing to take the forgotten road. With those words resting in his heart, Elion thanked the people of Frosthaven and began another journey, knowing that somewhere beyond the endless sands another forgotten story was patiently waiting to be remembered. The dawnwind sailed eastward beneath a sky washed in pale morning light, carrying Elion away from the island of first stories with the seed of beginnings safely hidden inside his satchel. The sea remained unusually calm, as though even the waves understood the importance of the small glowing seed entrusted to the young keeper. For several days the crystal lantern shone with a gentle silver flame, guiding the boat toward the mountain kingdom Lyra had shown him. At last the jagged peaks appeared beyond the horizon, their snow-covered summits rising above thick clouds that never seemed to move. As Elion climbed the winding stone road leading into the kingdom, he found magnificent halls, beautiful gardens, and grand libraries that had once been filled with music and celebration. Now every street lay strangely quiet. Painters had abandoned their easels, musicians left their instruments untouched, and sculptors had covered unfinished works with cloth, convinced that nothing they created would ever matter. The silence carried no anger or fear, only resignation. Walking through the capital, Elion met a young violin maker named Soren sitting alone inside a dusty workshop surrounded by beautifully carved instruments that no one wished to play. Soren quietly admitted that he had spent years crafting violins, yet after hearing endless criticism and seeing little appreciation, he had decided to burn his final creation before leaving the craft forever. Elion did not argue. Instead, he asked Soren to play one last melody before making his decision. Though reluctant, Soren lifted the unfinished violin and drew the bow across its strings. The first notes echoed softly through the empty street, then drifted into nearby homes where people paused to listen. An elderly woman opened her window and began singing words she had not remembered in decades. A child quietly joined the melody on an old wooden flute. Soon another musician appeared with a harp, followed by a drummer, a choir of villagers, and dancers who had long forgotten the joy of performing. What began as one hesitant melody became a celebration filling every corner of the city. High above the kingdom, the heavy clouds slowly parted, allowing warm sunlight to pour across the rooftops for the first time in many years. Deep beneath the forgotten chapel, the Chronicle of Echoes responded by writing Soren's name in brilliant gold beneath the words, "The one who played before he believed." Elion smiled, understanding that courage often arrived after the first step rather than before it. That evening he quietly planted the seed of beginnings in the center of the kingdom's silent square. The earth glowed softly as delicate roots spread beneath the ancient stones, and by sunrise a young white oak had already emerged, its leaves shimmering with silver and gold. People gathered beneath its branches not because they had been told to, but because they once again believed their gifts could bring hope to others. As Elion prepared to continue his travels, the compass turned toward a distant valley hidden beyond the northern mountains, while the crystal lantern burned brighter than ever before. The chronicle revealed one final message before the page turned. Every heart awakened becomes a light for another still waiting in the darkness. Carrying those words with him, Elion set out once more, unaware that another forgotten soul was already waiting for the keeper's arrival, and that the next chapter of the chronicle had quietly begun long before their paths would finally cross. The morning after Lyra revealed the true purpose of the keepers, the island of first stories awakened beneath a sky painted with brilliant shades of gold and sapphire. Gentle winds carried thousands of glowing leaves from the great tree across the sea, each one searching for a heart that had nearly forgotten how to hope. Elion stood beneath the ancient branches, holding the white oak branch Lyra had entrusted to him, when the entire sanctuary began humming with a soft, harmonious sound. One by one, the stone pillars surrounding the chamber illuminated, and beneath every carved name appeared a second line that had never existed before. Instead of describing what each person had done, the new inscriptions revealed the lives that had been transformed because of those simple acts of kindness. A child once saved from hunger had grown into a healer who rescued hundreds during a terrible plague. A lonely traveler welcomed into a stranger's home had later founded a village where no one was ever left without shelter. A forgotten teacher had inspired generations of students, whose discoveries changed distant kingdoms. Elion realized that no act of compassion ever ended with the person who first performed it. Every choice created another, like ripples spreading endlessly across a quiet lake. Lyra smiled as she watched him understand. "This," she said softly, "is the living chain. The chronicle records a single story, but the world carries its echoes forever." As her words faded, the great tree released one radiant seed unlike the others. It floated gently into Elion's hands, glowing with a warm light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lyra explained that this was the seed of beginnings, the final gift of the island of first stories. It could never be planted by a keeper for themselves. It would bloom only when given freely to someone who had lost all faith in their own future. Before Elion could ask another question, the crystal dome above the sanctuary shimmered, revealing a vision of a distant mountain kingdom wrapped in heavy clouds. Once famous for music, art, and celebration, the kingdom had slowly fallen silent as people abandoned their dreams, believing failure was stronger than hope. The chronicle, resting far away beneath the hidden library, suddenly opened on its own, and a single golden sentence appeared across its pages. Every new beginning is born from someone who refuses to let another person lose hope. Lyra gently placed her hand upon Elion's shoulder and told him that his greatest journey was no longer about discovering forgotten places but about helping forgotten hearts remember their own light. With the seed of beginnings safely protected inside his satchel, the young keeper walked back toward the peaceful shore where the dawnwind waited upon calm waters. As the boat quietly drifted away from the island, the great tree shimmered beneath the morning sun, and thousands of white birds rose into the sky together, carrying the promise that Hamnet's legacy would continue not through monuments or legends, but through ordinary people choosing compassion again and again, until every corner of the world held a story worth remembering. The night after the ancient white oak blossomed, the Garden of Beginnings remained bathed in a gentle silver glow as countless luminous leaves drifted into the sky, each one carrying the promise of a story yet to be written. Hamnet and Elion sat together beneath the great tree until dawn, speaking not of battles won or legends remembered, but of the quiet moments that had changed their lives forever. Hamnet confessed that, after all his years as a keeper, he had discovered the world's greatest miracles were never loud. They happened when a lonely child found a friend, when an old promise was finally kept, when forgiveness replaced resentment, or when a stranger chose kindness without expecting anything in return. Those moments, he said, became the invisible roots that held the entire world together. As the first light of morning reached the garden, the ancient tree suddenly released a deep, peaceful hum. From within its glowing trunk, a hidden doorway slowly appeared, revealing a circular chamber carved from pure white stone. Unlike every sanctuary Elion had visited before, the chamber contained only one object, a crystal table upon which rested an unwritten book bound in pale silver leather. Its pages were completely blank, yet they shimmered with quiet life. Hamnet gently placed his hand upon the cover and explained that this was the Book of Tomorrow, created by the first storykeepers long before the Chronicle of Echoes. The Chronicle faithfully preserved every completed act of compassion, but the Book of Tomorrow held something even more precious: the hopes, dreams, and possibilities that had not yet become reality. It remained empty because the future could never be written in advance. Every generation filled its pages through the choices it made. As Elion stepped closer, the blank pages reflected countless faces, not kings or heroes, but ordinary people from villages, cities, mountains, deserts, and islands, each standing before a single decision that could change another life forever. Some were preparing to forgive, others to teach, protect, create, heal, or simply listen. Hamnet smiled quietly and said, "The future is never built by one great act. It is built by thousands of quiet choices that no one thinks history will remember." At that very moment, one page within the Book of Tomorrow began glowing. Without ink or pen, a single golden sentence slowly appeared: "Every sunrise offers the world another chance to become kinder than it was yesterday." The words faded almost as soon as they appeared, leaving the page blank once more, reminding Elion that tomorrow always belonged to those willing to create it. Outside the chamber, the branches of the ancient white oak swayed gently though no wind stirred the island. Across distant kingdoms, white oak saplings planted by Hamnet and later by Elion continued to grow beside schools, harbors, villages, gardens, libraries, and quiet crossroads, silently witnessing new acts of generosity every day. Standing together beneath the vast morning sky, Hamnet placed a reassuring hand upon Elion's shoulder before turning toward the glowing horizon. "One day," he said softly, another traveler will find a forgotten key beneath another white oak. When that day comes, remind them that keepers are never chosen because they are extraordinary. They become extraordinary because they choose to care. As the sun climbed above the sea, the Garden of Beginnings shimmered with renewed life, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, another story quietly took its very first step, waiting for the moment when hope would transform it into a memory worthy of the chronicle. The sun climbed higher above the Garden of Beginnings, casting rivers of golden light through the branches of the first white oak, whose shimmering leaves continued drifting across the world like silent messengers of hope. After Hamnet's words faded into the peaceful morning, he invited Elion to walk beyond the ancient garden to a place that no keeper had entered for many generations. A narrow path of white stone wound through fields of wildflowers until it reached a quiet hill overlooking the endless sea. At its summit stood a simple circle of 12 smooth stones surrounding an eternal flame that burned without smoke or heat. There were no grand statues, no monuments, and no names carved into the earth. Hamnet explained that this place was known as the Circle of Quiet Promises, where every keeper came only once, not to receive power, but to make a single promise that would guide every choice for the rest of their life. No promise was written down. None was spoken aloud to another. The flame alone remembered. Hamnet revealed that his own promise had been to ensure no act of kindness would ever disappear without leaving hope behind, while Elias had promised to guide every new keeper with patience instead of fear. Now it was Elion's turn. He stepped quietly toward the eternal flame, closed his eyes, and reflected on every person whose path had crossed his own: the lonely painter Rowan, the librarian Miriam, the violin maker Soren, the teacher Anya, the mapmaker Ferris, Sister Morella, Tomas the gardener, Oren the storyteller, and countless ordinary people whose courage had inspired entire communities. Though no words escaped his lips, the flame suddenly brightened with a warm silver-gold light, and for a brief moment every white oak across the kingdoms shimmered together beneath the midday sky, as though the world itself had accepted the promise carried within Elion's heart. At that very instant, deep beneath the forgotten chapel, the Chronicle of Echoes opened to a fresh page without anyone touching it. Instead of recording another completed story, it simply displayed a single glowing sentence: "A promise kept in silence can echo louder than 1,000 spoken vows." Elias, watching from the hidden library, smiled peacefully as the page settled into radiant gold. Returning from the Circle of Quiet Promises, Hamnet and Elion stood once more beneath the first white oak. The ancient tree released one final shower of silver leaves before becoming still, as if entrusting the future completely to those who would come after. Looking across the sea toward the distant kingdoms, Elion understood that there would always be new villages to visit, forgotten dreams to awaken, friendships to restore, and stories waiting to begin. The Chronicle would continue preserving those moments, but it was the choices of ordinary people that would forever give its pages meaning. As evening approached, the dawnwind gently rocked against the shore, ready for another voyage. Elion stepped aboard with quiet confidence.